All right, it looks like we're good to go. We got the signal in the booth. All right, I'd like to welcome you today to a panel of just an amazing collection of experts in environment and climate justice. I'm Dr. Deb Morrison with Clear Environmental, and today we're going to talk about strategic coordination for climate and environmental justice. We have joining us today Dr. Robert Bullard from the Bullard Center for Environmental Justice. We have Dr. Beverly Wright from the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, and we have Ms. Peggy Shepard from We Act for Environmental Justice, and Senator Markey of Massachusetts. So thank you all for being here, and I will dive right in with the first question. All right, so we're going to start with Ms. Shepard. How should governments, civil society organizations, and communities coordinate their efforts to best accelerate climate justice? And there should be a mic on the table in front of you there. I would just speak.
Well, thank you, Deb, and good morning to everyone. Good morning to Senator Markey as well. So the first thing we've got to do is to vote in the right folks. We've got to educate community residents, to educate their elected officials. Elected officials generally want to hear from the people who are in their districts. We also have to coordinate those issues with government. When we think about, for instance, Justice 40 or the Inflation Reduction Act, how are we going to get those monies to the communities to which they are intended? And to do that, we need our folks at the grassroots level holding their elected officials accountable. We need officials like Senator Markey talking to the federal agencies, to the Biden administration, to ensure that there are mechanisms put into place to ensure that that money goes where it needs to go. We need to ensure that states have penalties or money is withdrawn if the monies do not go to the communities to which they were intended. And we heard Administrator Regan yesterday say that if EPA funds went to a state and those funds were not used in the communities to which they were intended, they would withdraw the money. So we need that kind of accountability, and we only have that accountability with an informed electorate, informed elected officials, and continued pressure on the government.
Dr.
Yeah, I think, just to follow up with Peggy, I think it's important that we recognize it's best when we use current infrastructure, social infrastructure that's working in the community. That if we're to accelerate climate solutions, those solutions oftentimes can come much more effective from communities who know the issues, who know what's needed, and if there are already existing institutions, bodies, networks that are performing well and have performed well over the decades, those needs to be that's what needs to be the first line of actions, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. For example, we have an HBCU climate change consortium, for example, that's been working on climate change, environmental justice, issues around health equity, issues around community empowerment, issues around building out strong networks. And so if we're to accelerate real solutions, those infrastructures need to be the first recipients of funding. And because we have, like our institutions, Texas Southern University, the Bullard Center, we operate from priorities that are basically bottom up, from communities. We don't parachute in, we work directly in partnership. That's the kind of social infrastructure that supports real action, and when resources follow need, that's when you get real solutions, and building out long-term solutions in a proactive way, but also in a coordinated way. Environmental justice, economic justice, health justice, transportation justice, and racial justice. That's how you deal with this in a real way. And for too long, we were timid, shy, and we walked away from it. But now it's not these issues are not footnotes anymore. They are headlines. And for those of us who worked on this for many years, we are really excited.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I believe that I've attended 13 COPs of the 22 of 26 now. And one of the experiences that I had was that I noticed that African American students in particular were not represented. And so after coming a few years and looking around at all of these people who were speaking for us, but were not us, this question that's been put forth to us is one that we try to figure out. How do we get, communities, people who are most impacted, involved around these issues, specifically here at COP, but even before we get to COP? And I believe that we've come up with a model that we have put in place that has resulted in our bringing a contingency of 50 people to COP 20. And then at this particular COP, we have another almost 50 people engaging at all the levels. But more than that, we have pulled together the first ever climate justice pavilion. Thank you. Yeah. So in between all of those years, we have also found a way to work very closely with the big greens or the big green organizations that have not always been our friend. We have cultivated a relationship with them in a way that now works. We don't see eye to eye on everything, but on those things that we do, we move forward to push policies in that direction. And I'd say secondly, we have cultivated community members in a way that they now have voice, working directly with our organizations on the ground. That's the Bullitt Center, the Deep South Center, WEAC, and there are a few other centers not represented here today that are cultivating communities to have voice. And as Bullitt said, all of our work is bottomed up. It's community driven. The concerns that we present to you or to Senator Markey absolutely come from communities. We believe that this is a model that works, and we plan to continue.
Well, it's great to be here with these environmental justice giants. Peggy, Dr. Bright, Dr. Bullard, thank you so much for your lifelong dedication to these issues. Back in long ago and far away, when I was able to do a big climate bill that passed the House with Henry Waxman in 2007, 2009. Ultimately, the oil and gas and coal industry killed it in the Senate. 1,400 pages long. So 4 years ago, this week, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected in New York as a congresswoman. So I called her up, and I asked her if we could have lunch in the Senate dining room, which we did, for 2.5 hours. And we talked about not having 1,400 pages for a bill, but 14 pages, and we called it the Green New Deal. And I introduced it in the Senate, and she introduced it in the House. And laced throughout all 14 pages is environmental justice, which Fox News continues to call socialism. Now, what I realized was that what was missing was a movement in America back 15 years ago. We didn't have a movement. We had people who cared about the issues. The big greens cared about the issues. But there was no real movement behind it. So what's happened is, out of communities all across the country, people have risen up and they demanded climate justice. So in this bill that was just signed by President Biden, $60 billion is earmarked for environmental justice in the United States. That's unprecedented. $60 billion. And it's going to be for the Department of Energy, for the EPA, the largest programs they have to administer. These are going to be huge programs. And what we have to make sure, because they are powerful but older institutions, that this money gets down, which is the goal of the Green New Deal. It's to get it down into the hands of the people in the community. For example, I was able to build in a $20 billion climate bank, of which half of the money has to go into communities. And we just have to make sure that those communities have the institutional capacity to be able to apply for the grants, to be able to administer these programs, because otherwise we know what will happen. So we have to be very intentional, and I've had these conversations over and over again with the Biden administration officials about what our goals are. Because this is a bottom-up revolution that took place over the last several years, and the product is one that we can be proud of and boast about to the rest of the world, but we haven't implemented it yet. We haven't actually showed yet that we can get this money into the hands of the people who need it. For example, there's $7 billion in the bill for community solar. Just the earmark for community solar, $7 billion. So we have to make sure that that solar goes into the communities, onto the roofs, into the areas of all of the communities that have historically been overlooked. So that's my goal, and these are the leaders from across the country who created this movement, and I'm just honored to be on the panel with them. Just honored to be with you.
Thank you. And maybe we can kind of ground ourselves a little bit more too, because there has been just a very deep and long history of the movement in environment and climate justice in the U.S., and it's influenced the global scene very much. And so if any of you want to speak to that, or also to the question of capacity, because I know in all of your organizations and across the HBCU Climate Change Network and many other sort of aspects of this work, that there's a huge amount of work going on in capacity building in community, not only to just receive from the federal space or from other state spaces, but also to share knowledges from local space, the ways that things are working and generated by local folks.
Let me just say that the three of us on this stage were part of the planning for the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991 in Washington, D.C. And at that summit, it was planned by individual organizations and institutions in the U.S., but we had delegates from at least a half dozen international from abroad, from different countries around the world. And at that summit, we developed 17 principles of environmental justice. And the overarching theme of those principles is that people most impacted by environmental and climate change and other environmental challenges must speak for themselves, must be in those rooms when decisions are being made, and must be at the right place at the right time to have the capacity to not only receive funds, but also to build the capacity to generate funds. It's not just receiving, it's also pushing out resources to their communities. And so over these years, since 1991 to today, when we left that summit in 91, we dedicated our work to making sure that the organizations on the ground, in communities, in frontline communities, would have organizations that could speak for themselves and do for themselves and reach out to make those changes that they saw were priorities. And as I said before, 1991, it was environmental and climate justice was more like a footnote. Today, it's a headline that is driving the global climate movement. When we went from 1991 in D.C. to the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in June of 92, our principles had been translated into at least a half dozen languages and sent abroad. When we were there were 13 of us that went to Rio de Janeiro representing U.S. organizations. And in Johannesburg, Rio plus 20, there were thousands of organizations around climate and environmental justice that were pushing out these whole principles. And so what we have to do today is to make sure that the money and the resources that's been earmarked for the work in the U.S. get pushed out. We also have to fight to make sure that those who have contributed most of the problem, like the U.S., also contribute to the global fund for dealing with climate justice, loss and damage, issues around climate finance, and reparations. We have to be in sync with that if we are to be true to our principles.
So, of course, Deb, you're asking about capacity building. And Senator Markey, you mentioned your bill in 2007, 2009. So in 2009 in New York City, we developed the first Climate Justice National Conference so that we could begin, as an environmental justice movement, to talk with green groups, because we had not really begun to talk with them about policy. We were also concerned that the bill you mentioned did not have any environmental justice voices. So as a result, in 2009, we developed the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum on Climate Change to begin to develop the capacity of environmental justice organizations to understand climate science, to understand the technologies, so that we could lift our voices in legislation around climate change. And so we have done that, built that capacity over the years. As a result, philanthropy has now developed numbers of intermediary organizations that are funding small grassroots groups. As a result, the JPB Foundation, which has been funding climate issues, has started the Fund to Build Grassroots Power. And so we act as one of the grantees, and we are advising at least $1.5 million to the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. And we have been able to seed the capacity of numbers of groups to become those kinds of leaders and really strong anchor groups in their states. So again, we're in a period of capacity building so that organizations can have the staff, the expertise they need to engage in policy making, so that their voices can come to Washington. We can be in those meetings with you to advise and to also begin to develop the regulations, because as you develop policies, there's a whole system of developing the regulations. And the environmental justice movement has never been involved in regulatory setting. So we are now developing the capacity to do that. And as a result, that EJ is having that moment, that philanthropy is understanding that there cannot be climate justice without those at the grassroots, those the most affected, to be involved in that policy making. And so we are all now ensuring that our groups get that capacity building, because three of us cannot do that alone. We have to have the movement strong, with a strong voice, and engaged with the expertise to develop that policy.
We'll try this one. I think it's, this one is working. So I just want to say that the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice became involved in the work of giving voice to communities as it relates to environmental pollution in 1992. So our struggle is very long, and coming from Louisiana, if you know anything about Louisiana, it is continuing. So we launched the first, we call it petrochemical campaign in the Mississippi River chemical corridor in 1992. And at that time, we had maybe 2 Enviro's Big Greens working with us, Greenpeace and NRDC, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a long time, and a little bit from Sierra Club. But what has happened since that time, and at that time there was 800 million pounds of pollution being released in an 85-mile stretch of land, poisoning the air, the water, and the soil. Today, we're down to 200 plus million pounds, which is still more than the whole state of Texas to some extent. And what I've learned from that is the first thing that you must do is educate the communities so that they can have the voice that they need to fight the politicians. And in Louisiana, it is always fighting the politicians. It is not that they are working with us. We've made little gains with a few politicians, but guess what? Those politicians have not been from Louisiana. They have been from California and Detroit in particular, who worked with us, or Michigan, who worked with us along the way. And so we are, at this point, learning to engage our political leadership. It should start with the local and the state, but for us, it's always started at the federal level because that's where we've had the best results. And moving from the federal level to the state and then to our local communities. I realize that that seems backwards, but in a red state like where we are, sometimes you need the push of the federal government to get the attention of your state government and then the cooperation of your local government. So our fight is one where we have to, first of all, develop our organizations in such a way that they have voice. Once we develop their voice, we can begin communication with our federal agencies, then state and local, to see some change. And so we have seen changes occurring because of our ability to grow the voices on the ground. And those voices on the ground affect politicians in particular. And I like calling them politicians because that's what we're dealing with, not like Senator Markey. We're talking about politicians, if you know what I mean. And there is a difference. So sorry. No, sorry.
Well, you know, politics is a stimulus response institution, and there's nothing more stimulating than thousands of people all of a sudden rising up and saying this is an issue. And the beauty now is that we've got at the EPA, we've got at the Department of Energy, we've got the people who want to get the money down into the community. So that'll draw a lot of politicians' attention. And because they like to divvy up the money. And the good news is that we've constructed this in a way, hopefully, there's a long way from your dream and then the execution of the dream, but the money's going down to the local level. And there's going to have to be a lot of muscle that is exercised in order to ensure that it gets spent right. When I was a boy, people say, when did you become an environmentalist? And I said, well, when I was 10 years old. Every city in America has the pollution ward. It's where all the dirty industries are. So that was the ward I grew up in. And the Malden River was 3 blocks from my house. Converse Rubber made every Converse All-Star in Ward 2 in Malden. And then they used the Malden River as the dumping ground. And the chemical companies and the coal companies, everyone used the Malden River. And there was just a big cloud over my ward, 3 blocks from my house growing up. And my mother would say, Eddie, whatever you do, don't swim in the Malden River. You're not Tom Sawyer growing up on the Mississippi. And we know that those are the communities that have always been overlooked. Those are the dumping grounds. And kind of everyone accepts that there's a dumping ground in every city. And in a way, almost the people in that ward get used to being in the ward. That's the dumping ground. Because that's just the way it is. See, but now what's happened is there's It's a new game. It's a new time. It's a new organization. And people are saying, we're not taking no for an answer. So from my perspective, we're going to have to police this, honestly. We're going to have to police it with the federal agencies, to make sure that they use their clout on the local politicians to finally get the people who know where the problems are, know the people, get the resources they need. And we have Joe Biden. He wants to do the right thing. That's why there's a Justice 40. We have $60 billion minimum that is going to be available for these programs. But we should, in my opinion, set up this new infrastructure fast in the next 2 years to make sure it's there to be protected for the years ahead, because we have no guarantee that someone who got their climate degree, their environmental degree from Trump University isn't taken over in a couple of years. So let's take this moment to accelerate the process of institutionalizing community groups as the power in making the decisions. Yep.
Yes, I agree totally. And there are technologies that we have available today that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago. And I think a lot of the resources that have come to us today, and particularly to our organizations and to our universities that have centers, environmental and climate justice centers, that have partnerships with communities, frontline communities. We have technologies today that we develop in our center. We're developing environmental and climate justice screening tools and funding tracking tools that can actually follow the money. I mean, that's one thing that we've always said, is that we don't have all of the tools that we need to track the dollars and then ensure that the dollars is going where it needs to go. But today we can use the most sophisticated tools and technologies to use GIS mapping and other screening tools to actually go all the way down to the census tract level to find out where that money is going and who's receiving those dollars. And we are building those models and those tools so that our community-based organizations, in partnership with our institutional EJ centers, can actually track those dollars, evaluate who's getting it, and actually have a rapid response team that can, where there are roadblocks and where there's a blockage in terms of money not going to where red states, not sending the money to the blue cities, we have a rapid response to deal with that with legal as well as other kinds of mechanisms to unblock those barriers and challenges. And we know there will be challenges. I live in Texas, and we anticipate that. So we're planning for those challenges, but we're also planning for having a successful rollout of these funds.
Well, Senator Markey said something really, really important. He said that there are sacrifice zones, and people get used to living there. And it really came home to me because we run an environmental health and justice leadership training program, and we do that in several high schools in New York City. And after the program, we do it every spring semester, and one of the students wrote a letter and said, I had gotten used to, I just thought this was the way you were supposed to live, with mold, with pests, with, poor air quality. I didn't realize that we had an option. And so when we were able to give them the education, the information, and the support to mobilize, that is what is so critical. The support to mobilize, they realized that they had an option for their community, that they could change it, that it didn't have to be that way. And so that's why you hear all of us talking about education, information, because you cannot mobilize without that education, without that catalyst. And so that's what we're all trying to be, the catalyst for our next generations.
Yes. Thank you, Peggy. I love the way you put that, the catalyst. The foundation of the Deep South Center is in education. I'd like to tell this story, and I'm going to do it very quickly, but at our center, we developed a dictionary for all of our community members, some of whom had not graduated from high school, so that they would know the acronyms that are used at the different agencies, specifically EPA. And I'll never forget when Ms. West stood up, a grandmother, and told an EPA person who was there, Sonny, I know what CERCLA means. I know what RCRA is. And the guy's eyes got very big. But the engagement changed at that particular point. We developed 12 different modules for training community people. From one called Face to Face, where we were like a travel agency, because all we did was created meetings for community groups coming from Louisiana, from the chemical corridor, to visit EPA and talk directly with people who were over enforcement, for example. So that was like 13 years that we spent working, educating the community so that they could have a voice in teaching them how to interact with government to make them respond to their needs. That particular work forms what I call the beginning of the developing a grassroots infrastructure. And I believe it's time for us to talk about Justice 40 and our Justice 40 project, because that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to develop a grassroots infrastructure, and working between the three of us, we're really working on the community level. That is, educating them on what Justice 40 means, and working with, for example, Metropolitan Consulting Firm, Bernice Miller is here, to help us deal with tracking and storytelling. And from there, Peggy and Bob can talk about the specifics of what they're doing, but Peggy for certain is dealing with the political end. Where's the money? Who's there? And how do you teach communities to really talk with the people who will be responsible for getting the money out? And Bob, of course, is the research arm, doing the tracking, developing tools. But what we believe is that between the three of us, pooling our resources together, Senator Markey, we will be able to make certain that the people who should be receiving these funds will get these funds. We can't do it all, but the part that we can do, we are going to do to make this, I would say, goal or dream a reality. We realize that this is our first chance at really having access to huge dollars. And I just want to add this. Our communities are also beginning to learn about loss and damage and financing for the global South. You know, we deal with the, I'm going to call it the northern South, where all of the chemicals are, but we are making that connection with the global South and recognizing reparations are needed in the red states for certain, but they're also needed in the global South, and we are trying to join together in that fight.
And I think one thing that you really name here, Dr. Wright, to bring it back into this global context as well, is what Deep South has focused on is really that action for climate empowerment component. So Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, and you were all well ahead of even the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC, which was 1992, in defining that as a central role. And that type of education is actually going in multiple directions, because when you're having community members talk face-to-face with the EPA is learning and growing and becoming aware of all the knowledge and experiences that are in community and shifting their own understandings and awareness, which is also a deeply critical part of this whole puzzle to you know, just shift how the injustices based on race, based on colonial aspects of work have been experienced inside the United States and beyond. I know that Senator Markey might have to part with us in a minute here. I do want to dig more deeply into the Justice 40 initiative in our last 15 minutes, but if Senator Markey has to part, I just wanted to allow him the last word.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we're here with the Mount Rushmore of climate justice, environmental justice. It's just such an honor to be with you. Thank you for your great work, your historic work. What I did was, when we began this whole process, I actually called Congresswoman Cori Bush from St. Louis. And I said to her, let's partner in the House and Senate to have an environmental justice mapping provision. So we added tens of millions of dollars into this bill to map the whole country, to find every ward that's the sacrifice ward all across the country, to map where it is, what the problems are, and then we can insist that the money get targeted at those wards, those parts of town, and again, my grandfather got off the boat from Ireland. He worked on the Malden River in a coal plant. I never got to know my grandfather because God knows what they were exposed to, and dumping this stuff into the river as well. So I never met him. I didn't meet any of my grandparents. They had hard lives, right? They all lived in that ward because they got off the boat. They had a hard life. And I'm glad that, Dr. Wright, you're talking about this. A lot of these countries around the world, they are the sacrifice wards for the world. We have been using them as the dumping ground. We've been using them to have a science experiment with how much greenhouse gases can the world tolerate, and then watch the poorest people in the planet who can't protect themselves. So loss and damage is very important. That's essentially just another word for environmental justice in the United States, for the sacrificial wards. And we have to identify with and work with them to accomplish the goal. But the example you're setting, the framework that you're creating, that you've already created actually, now we just have to educate everyone all across the country so that we set this as the precedent that no bill ever passes again that doesn't have environmental justice in the middle of it, because we're not going to finish it with $60 billion. That's just a down payment. There's just so much damage which has been done, so much harm that has been put in place. So I can't tell you how honored I am to have joined the three of you, just the greats, the giants of the environmental justice movement. Thank you for the honor of being with you. Thank you.
So we're going to take a moment and just take a photo before Senator Markey goes, if that's all right, and then we'll just come back to the conversation about Justice 40, if that's okay.
May I do this? If you don't, yeah. If I can do this, just, yeah. Can I just do this quickly? I'm here with the environmental justice giants of our country, Dr. Bullock, Dr. Wright, Peggy Shepard from New York. These have been the pioneers. These have been the fighters, the warriors throughout the decades, and finally, their time has come. And here, people now have, for the first time, a full appreciation for the need to have environmental justice here in the United States, but across the whole planet. So thank you, giants.
You're here.
Great leaders.
Woo-hoo!
Thank you, guys. Really, again.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're great. Thank you.
Great. So if we can come back to the conversation about Justice 40 and the Justice 40 specifically around what you're working on in terms of building that capacity and network around Justice 40. If you want to share, we have about 10 minutes of time to just share anything you like about Justice 40 and the partnership building.
Sure. You know, one thing that strikes me about Justice 40, which we live and breathe every day, but so few people actually know what it is. And we're also finding out that very few of our local elected officials have ever heard of it. And so one of the initiatives that we're developing is a strong national communications plan and really working to go around the country with federal officials to host meetings with electeds and other community leaders so that they understand what Justice 40 is and what their responsibility and accountability needs to be to ensure that that money gets to the right projects and to the right communities. And so communications is crucial, but it's also crucial to ensure that we have accountability hubs in key cities of grassroots organizations and a strong collaboration so that they can hold their governments accountable. And that's going to be very difficult depending on the state. If it's a red state, some of the southern states are going to be very difficult. You'll hear about that from Dr. Bob and Dr. Beverly. But we've got to have that accountability, otherwise we'll have billions of dollars going out the door to the same people, disinvesting in the same communities. We also understand that even with the infrastructure bill and the IRA bill, that our communities almost need a pre-investment to accept the investment. We have been so disinvested in for so long that our buildings, if we're talking about electrification and decarbonization, our buildings aren't even ready for electrification. We were trying to do a demonstration project called Out of Gas to switch out gas stoves for electric stoves, and we found that very few buildings had the electrical upgrades to even allow us to switch out those gas stoves. So the pre-investment that's needed to decarbonize our buildings is a great one. And we found it took 6 months to find a landlord who had the money to do that pre-investment. So again, we've been so disinvested in that we've got to use this money to just get our communities up to a level where they can actually totally utilize the investment that's coming down.
Would you like to say anything about the research components or any of the networking related to Justice 40?
Okay. Well, is this one working?
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Okay. With our Justice 40 project, from the perspective of the Deep South Center, nothing can be done without the communities being educated. So you can have the greatest program in the world, the best ideas, but if communities don't buy into it, then you're just sitting out there with the project and people who don't really need it end up getting it. And so training communities about Justice 40 is the first run for us. So we are developing through our training institute Justice 40 101 and Justice 40 102. We've already begun with introducing communities from 22 states at our first conference in the city of New Orleans to the whole idea of Justice 40. And they are really excited and ready to get to work. We're going to have our second convening in January, where we will begin to really educate communities on what Justice 40 is. That education will also include meeting communities where they are in terms of the work that they're doing to see if in fact they are ready to immediately begin applying for grants. And we have some of our communities who are ready. They've gone through our Gulf Coast Water Institute, Gulf Coast Water Justice Institute, through our HBCU Climate Change Consortium, where we have been training communities in the southern region of the Gulf Coast for 8 years. So some communities are absolutely ready because of the infrastructure that we have already built between Dr. Bullock Center and mine in the south. Some communities are just getting started, and we are in the process of doing an assessment to determine where communities are so that we can begin to do this work. So the work, there is a structured plan for moving us, or I say a roadmap, for taking communities from where they are now to where they need to be to request these funds. And it's going to take the three of us to get it done, with Peggy's group really, really honing in on the political side of it, making certain that we can connect politicians with communities in particular states. And as she said, Bullitt and I are in red states. It can be more difficult because of who the people we're working with. But as Senator Markey said, they want the money. And so if politicians see that this may bring some money into their communities, then they are more open. But we have to make sure that that money goes where it's supposed to go. That's our plan. And I would say stay tuned for next year to see just how many communities we can get to where we want them to be. That is actually applying for grants or working with their state or city for block grants that really address their problems. We're hoping to be able to accomplish that goal, but I know that it's going to take all three of our organizations to get that done. 20 states so far. We hope to cover 50 states before it's over with, but we are on the move.
Okay, quickly, I think what we realize is that as the laws got passed and signed, we were anticipating this happening. And over the last decade and a half, we have built an infrastructure that combines our history and legacy. I'm speaking specifically for African Americans, in using our historically black colleges and universities that are oftentimes located on the front line of climate change. And they are located in communities that probably have the perfect characteristics for receiving funds under Justice 40 benefits, bipartisan infrastructure law, and Inflation Reduction Act. What our center at Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas, has done and is doing is using the relationships that we built in community university partnerships and the trust that we built with our communities to leverage the kinds of going forward and getting the right people and organizations and the networks in those rooms to work with our local officials and pressure our state government. In many cases, our schools are located disproportionately in red states. Our schools are located disproportionately in cities that are blue. So we will have a fight. We have law schools, we have schools of public health, we have planning schools, and so we will use all of those resources to make sure that they are applied to getting access to those funds. Our project is heavy on research, tracking, documenting, developing metrics. You know, over the last 40 years, I've written 18 books, and all of those books deal with justice, fairness, and equity. They may have different titles, but it's one book. Don't tell anybody. But the issue is we are using our resources at our HBCUs and at our centers to support the communities on the ground. And as I said before, our schools are located in 22 states, but they're disproportionately located in the Gulf Coast and the southeastern states, where 65% of African Americans live. So we know how to map, we know how to track, we know how to use our resources in a way, in a collaborative way. With the three of us working together, we are a powerful force arrayed for justice. It's not going to be easy, but if it was easy, it would have been done already. But the fact is that we have built this trust in our communities, and that's the most important ingredients. We're not parachuting into any community promising anything, but we're working with those communities, and those communities that hear about us, and we're getting a lot of calls who want to work with us. And so we're gonna expand our network, and we're gonna work with those communities and assist and support. We're not gonna lead. We don't lead in terms of organizing. We don't. I'm talking about our center, but we support that organizing, mobilization, education, training, etc. And we're excited about this because we've been doing this for 30 years without a dime. Now that there's billions available, you'd be surprised what you can do with money.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to just wrap it up. If there's any last thoughts that any of you want to share, I'll leave you an option to do that.
Yeah, I just want. It's been wonderful to be at this COP with our first climate justice pavilion ever in the Blue Zone. It's been really important.
Yeah.
Here, here.
Yeah.
It's important to align the perspectives, the voices from the global south with the global north, because all of our communities, whether they're in the north or south, we have sacrifice zones, they look the same, we have the same oppressor, we have similar conditions, we have different governments, but similar conditions. And so to come together and educate each other on our perspectives so that we can align our advocacy is crucial, and I am so glad to be here and to learn from my brothers and sisters around the world.
Thank you. Very good.
Ditto.
Thank you.
Yes, same here. We're excited. We have lots of young people, and that's the future. Intergenerational mobilization, I think that's where we need to make sure we strengthen and grow our movement for justice. Climate justice in the U.S. and global climate justice, and particularly those issues that resonate across the globe when we talk about equity, justice, and fairness. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I would invite everyone to come and visit the Climate Justice Pavilion. It's Pavilion 119. Please come and look at the programming. It's cjpavilion.org. So please do come and visit the pavilion. If you are not aware of any of the three organizations represented here or of the work of the Climate Justice Pavilion, I do encourage you to educate yourself. There are lots of resources on each of these organizations' websites. Please dig in and understand what environmental justice is. Thank you.
Thank you.